Is this boats and rail initiative of India, the Arab world and Europe going to prove to be a strong counter to China's Belt and Road initiative? Will the spice route get revived and really rise to its original conception in the way that you just heard historian William Dalrymple explain? Or has the Silk Route seeped in so deep that it's now difficult to reconfigure in the modern era? Joining us to talk about this and more, I have with me on this broadcast former Foreign Secretary Kanwal. We have with us Navdeep Singh Suri, Distinguished Fellow at the Observer Research Foundation, has been Ambassador to Egypt, the UAE and elsewhere. We have with us Andrew K.P. Loing, China strategist analyst, joining us from Hong Kong. And for a perspective from Washington, D.C., I have Michael Kugelman. I want to start by asking Kanwal Sibbal about the moment of this announcement on the sidelines of the G20. The details not fully out in terms of the exact route, but the idea is to revive the old spice route, India, the Arab world and Europe. Do you think that this has the capacity and the potency to be a strong counter to China's Belt and Road?
I think this initiative of India, Middle East, Europe corridor has a logic of its own, and we should not diminish its importance by talking about it as a competitor or a rival to the BRI. The BRI had a logic of its own, given China's huge financial resources, its huge overcapacities in many areas, its ambitions to be a global power. After all, if it has become the largest exporting country in the world, it means it has to export, it has to find markets, and it is combining both its manufacturing capacities and its financial capacities to develop these linkages through the BRI. That's fine. But that doesn't mean that countries like India or others have to think of rivaling them, because there is a logic of its own in terms of our connections to the Gulf countries, especially. If you've seen the transformation that has taken place in our relations with the Gulf country, it makes eminent sense. We signed an FTA with the UAE. We are thinking or hoping to sign with the GCC. Our relations with Saudi Arabia have been totally transformed. These two countries have huge and ambitious plans to transform and modernize their economies. You look at their 2030 vision documents and you can see what they are planning. India has a huge presence in this region in terms of manpower, including people who are technically qualified, as well as our energy resources come from this area. We have a lot of remittances coming from this area. Defense cooperation is on the anvil. There is the whole issue of food security, because these countries don't grow their own food. And India can actually give them assured food supplies by developing our agriculture in order to subserve their needs.
But Navdeep, what concerns me is the fact that some of these countries in the Arab world have fraught relations. You've served as an ambassador in different parts of the Arab world. At this moment, it seems that there is growing, not proximity, but at least the differences are being kept on the side. They're trying to work together, but we well know that that could change at any time. So you've made all this effort, made the investment, and relations turn, and we've seen this happen. There have been times when we've spoken about a Chabahar port, we've spoken about letting something pass through or near Pakistan, and then things change. So is that concern going to stay, that at this moment relations seem a certain way, at a point in time in the future relations could change?
Well, this is what the financial experts would call political risk, right? Which exists in many different dimensions. But I think, if we look at the map, really, apart from Europe, France, and Germany, where you wouldn't think much political risk, the House of Saud has been around for 100 years. In Saudi Arabia, the Nahyans have been ruling family in UAE for about 150 years now. So you would be able to call them reasonably stable monarchies in the context of monarchies. So I think the fact that the presidents of both UAE and Saudi Arabia were present around the table when this announcement was made, and previously in May, the national security advisors of the four countries had also met in Riyadh.
There's talk about Israel using the Haifa port as well as part of the same corridor.
Well, the relationship between Israel and UAE has transformed in the last 2 years post the Abraham Accords. There's a lot going on beneath the surface between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and we keep seeing reports about the Biden administration trying to stitch together a grand bargain where relations would also be established between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And by all accounts, the Saudis are not averse to the relationship in principle. It's just what can they get in return in terms of security guarantees from the Biden administration and some sort of a deal for the Palestinians. So there's a lot going on that. I think the relationship today, post the Abraham Accords, is far more positive and conducive to this kind of a corridor than it was even 3 years back.
So why is America pushing this so hard? Ultimately, if this is happening on the sidelines of the G20 in India, the role of President Biden and the American administration is crucial. That this improves trade between India, the Arab world, and Europe seems quite possible. What's in it for America?
I think,
Michael
from the American... Okay.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I think first, just a brief caveat. I think it's important. We don't want to jump the gun with this new project. Many of these grand connectivity corridors that have emerged in recent years haven't really panned out, and that includes the G7's Build Back Better initiative, even the Chabahar port issue. I think that we need to be careful not to overstate just how far this is going to go. That said, to your point, this is very important from a U.S. perspective for several reasons. One is that I think it reflects a U.S. reset of its policy in the Middle East, which has been building for several years, moving away from a security-focused, militarized policy of the past where the U.S. was fighting wars in the Middle East and involved in counterterrorism activities. It's trying to move away from that and focus more on building partnerships with its close friends to pursue integration and trade. And one reason for this is that the U.S. is not as reliant on energy supply as it had been in the Middle East in the past, and it's not fighting wars in the region for now. So it's trying to focus on building these broader types of longer-term commercial links with its allies and partners. I'd argue that the India factor is important here with the United States. It wants to work with India outside of the Indo-Pacific as the partnership expands and becomes stronger. And certainly the Abraham Accord issue is important here as well, as your last speaker noted. This is a big priority. One of the few foreign policy successes of the Trump administration that the Biden administration actually agrees with, the Abraham Accords. And indeed, I think from Washington, one of the hopes is that this corridor will build up more trade links, and through that more goodwill and trust that could eventually lead Israel to normalize relations with more of its Arab neighbors, especially Saudi Arabia. And this, of course, builds on the I2U2 project, which the U.S. is a big proponent of. Again, the idea is to build more trust and goodwill between Israel and its neighbors to try to create more formal relationships. And finally, I think that, yes, the China factor is critical here. I know that many participants in this corridor would not agree that this should be seen as a counter to China. But from a U.S. perspective, given the scope of U.S.-China competition, there is an idea here of presenting this corridor as an alternative to the investment model pursued by China's BRI. And we've already heard U.S. officials describe this as something that will be non-coercive, transparent, and that's a clear, an explicit contrast being drawn between this corridor and what the U.S. believes the Chinese investment model to be with BRI.
Let Andrew Lewing respond to this. Non-coercive, transparent, fiscally responsible, a direct counter to China's model of leaving countries indebted through the BRI project. So whether anybody says this on record or not in a government press conference, it's very clear this is being done to show countries in this patch of the world that this is a different way of building infrastructure and public goods in comparison to the model that China has been pushing. How do you see it, Andrew Lee?
Well, first of all, one has got to realize that the Belt and Road Initiative has been in place for over 10 years. And it is extremely extensive. It's got 6 economic corridors spanning all corners of the world, and nearly $1 trillion have been invested, even though some of them there was blowback and concerns in some quarters. But that's understandable because these are part of the learning curve of any pioneer. But as far as the Belt and Road Initiative is concerned, it is based on the fact that China is the largest trading partner to 128 countries around the world across the group, and not just in single region. And that's why there are 6 economic corridors. And it's based on the real trade, and the host countries have a very close trading partnership. I think China's the greatest trading partner. 128 countries compared with only 58 for the United States, let alone India. So the idea that this India, Middle East, and Europe corridor is going to displace the Belt and Road is a
no,
bit
it's
of
not about displacement. I don't think,
It-
Mr. Luing, it's about displacement. It's about showing an alternative model. China building infrastructure a certain way, leaving countries in Africa and elsewhere deeply indebted. India, Saudi Arabia, UAE, America getting together to show that infrastructure can be built a different way as well. So it's not about displacement, it's about offering an alternative instead.
Well, I think that China welcomes this Indian initiative because the more the world is connected, the more China, as the largest trading nation, would benefit. I don't think that China regards this new initiative negatively. And as far as the perceived problems of the Belt and Road is concerned, as I said, as part of the learning curve, as for indebtedness, it's instructive that a UK-based think tank, a UK-based charity called Debt Justice released a report only recently. They look at the indebtedness of a lot of developing countries, and they found that, in fact, they own most of their debt to Western commercial lenders rather than to China. So I'm not saying that China is exceedingly, sort of whiter than white. But on the other hand, as I said, it's part of the learning curve, and the debt resilience of the host countries is a big area for China to study.
Kanwal Sibbal, from Mr. Luing, that China didn't necessarily want to leave the beneficiary countries indebted because they were doing it for the first time. It's a learning curve for them, or do you think part of this whole effort is to lend, to build, but actually then, whether it's a Hambantota or elsewhere, to take over the asset and to make it your own?
Well, that criticism is very widespread, and countries are becoming very alert to this, including in Africa. So there is a bit of a blowback with regard to the BRI. And there is a belief that China itself is walking away a little bit from this project, at least at the government level, and leaving it to the banks to support it, because they know many of these loans that they have offered will not be paid back. But they'll let China deal with its own problems. But I'll come back to a very important issue, which is that both UAE and Saudi Arabia are part of the BRI project. Now, if we try and push the line that it is to compete with China and project it as a rival to China's BRI, I don't think it serves any larger purpose. Sure. The second thing is, and that's very important, if you look at what is intended, whether it is achieved fully or not is a different matter. It is a shipping hub between our ports and the Arabian coast, with green hydrogen, green ammonia, digital connections, telecommunications, pipelines under the sea, and then going on to through UAE, Saudi Arabia to Israel. Now, important thing also is that in the MOU that has been signed, which the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia has signed, there is a specific mention of the route that this corridor will take, and Israel is mentioned by name. So if Saudi Arabia had some serious concerns about Israel in this regard, they won't have.
No, but are you concerned that could change? Do you now see this as being irreversible?
No,
are you concerned this could change?
No, it won't change. It won't change because, as I said, it will actually be a failure of Saudi diplomacy if, having signed this in the presence of not only India, forget India for a moment, in the presence of Biden, in presence of Scholz, in presence of Macron, in the presence of the Italy's prime minister, and then walking back for it because of Israel. It doesn't make sense. If that was the concern, then in the initial discussions on this, they would have then tried to devise a route which bypassed Haifa. But that is not the case. Therefore, I don't think we should exaggerate it to that extent where there can be a walking back. Now, it may be that they may not be able to implement it in the time frames they have in mind. Within 2 months, they're going to discuss the modalities of it and the financing of it, and then they'll take a firm and final decision about how this project will be implemented. But the project is very good, very forward-looking.
And Navdeep Suri, you heard from William Dalrymple about ivory, perfumes, silk.
Yes. Last point, Rahul, very, very briefly, which is that the BRI has now been blocked because of the Ukraine conflict and the walking away of European countries, including the Baltic states, away from the BRI. So that original idea of connecting China to Europe through BRI, it will not work anymore in the foreseeable future. And this is an alternative route to Europe, which has a lot of potential. Sorry.
Navdeep Suri, we heard from William Dalrymple when he spoke of ivory, silk, spices, perfumes being the exports from India to Europe in the early years of the classic era. What do you see now as largely being stuff which Europe can send to India, India can send to Europe from this route? Because why I ask this is you don't want a situation where you build this infrastructure and then it doesn't get optimally utilized and it becomes a white elephant of sorts.
Well, before we jump from William's fascinating comments 2,000 years back to today, I think let's take a pause 1,000 years in between during the medieval period when the Arab sailors from Aden and Sharjah had discovered the patterns of the monsoon winds and were able to ride the winds both ways and actually expand the routes. So the route at that time was for the ships to catch the monsoon winds, arrive at Sharjah or Aden or Basra, and then via camel. That was the route across the desert to take the materials to either an Egyptian port just south of Safaga or to the Mediterranean directly. But the shortest route to the Nile was from Safaga, and then it would be put on boats and taken to the Mediterranean and onward to Europe. So the route that William talked about wasn't just then. Today, if you look at it, our largest trading partner as a bloc is the GCC. It's $240 billion of trade. And the shipping routes, the capacities, the linkages are very, very well established between particularly our West Coast ports from Kandla, Mundra, Nhava Sheva, Kochi, all the way down to the Gulf ports. India's third largest trading partner as a bloc, second largest actually, is the European Union. And so right now, all of the stuff that goes through these routes, particularly to Europe, goes through the Suez Canal. I think what COVID taught us, what that ship getting stuck in the Suez Canal taught us, is the importance of redundancy. It's the importance of building resilience in your supply chains, not being dependent completely on just one track. So even while the financials of this are going to be worked out, I think it's important that we look at it, firstly, as an alternate with some redundancy built in, which creates an alternate corridor to the Suez Canal. But secondly, very important that we also look at it in the context of other conversations about trusted data pipelines, right? If we are talking about not just goods exports, but service exports to take place, then you don't want pipelines that can be hacked or compromised by other players. You also bring in the Prime Minister's comment about one sun, one planet, one grid. And the fact that you can have electricity grids connected, and there's already conversations going on between India and UAE, India and Saudi Arabia on grid interconnectivity, using solar from both sides. I think these are very ambitious plans, and it's important not to just focus ourselves on physical movement of goods, but movement of products that you don't think of seeing, which are not
That's an
visible.
important point you make. The more I think about this, the deeper the logic seems to be behind this announcement, Michael Kugelman. Do you see the assets, whether they are in the form of data pipelines, hydrogen pipelines, oil pipelines, railways being fully juiced out and optimally utilized? Are you concerned, like with the BRI, some of it could end up as a white elephant, could take for years, decades maybe, for it to fully come to life in the way that it's being spoken of?
Well, absolutely. That's why I had cautioned caution at the beginning of this discussion, and that when you have an initiative that's so ambitious with so much scale, when you have so many participants covering so much territory, including some pretty fraught, volatile spaces, both in terms of land and sea, you really have to, I think, be careful with the expectations for sure. Though, I would argue that one reason to be a bit more optimistic about this project compared to some of the previous ones that have been pitched but never got anywhere is that these are countries and regions that really do want to work together, and I think we've been talking about that a lot. I mean, India, of course, views the Middle East as a critically important strategic space where it's been illustrating for a number of years its desire to scale up commercial relations because of energy interests and others. The U.S. continues to be very keen to engage with its allies and partners in the Middle East. And certainly, Europe wants to be a big part of this too. I mean, the main objective certainly is commercial interests, money making and so on. But I think the broader diplomatic and geopolitical incentives are very strong as well. But you look at the BRI case. I'd argue that of all of these big connectivity corridors that have emerged in recent years, BRI has made the most progress, even though it's run into a lot of setbacks. If you look at it a decade later, China clearly is very entrenched in terms of its investment presence throughout much of these spaces that are envisioned.
Final words, Andrew Lewing. On the BRI, word now coming out that the one country in Europe which was part of the BRI, Italy, has communicated formally to President Li Qiang when he was in Delhi that they intend to pull out. Earlier it was spoken of as a possibility. Apparently Giorgia Meloni, when she met with the Chinese Premier, has told him that they want out. Now China was hoping in fact to get more European countries on board. Given that the one European country the BRI had on board is now exiting, how big a blow is that to the credibility of the BRI, especially when it comes to China's relations with Europe?
Well, I think that everything depends on the real benefits. And then there was originally a great deal of hype on part of the Italians. And then they have this buyer's remorse, which is understandable, but it doesn't mean that it applies to other major trading partners of China, like Germany, for example. Germany is a very large exporter, not importer, but exporter to China. So obviously, the BRI offers a much more efficient kind of link, and that applies to many other countries. And in fact, it's not a unified picture because the BRI covers so many countries and so many different routes as a six economic corridors. And according to the latest World Bank report, which was out a couple of months ago, the BRI, looking at the BRI from the, of course, that there is apart from a negative side, that on a positive side, it has lifted something like 440 million people out of poverty in many host countries.
Okay.
And then creating 420,000 local jobs. So it's not as if the BRI is a complete failure, by no means. And in fact, the benefit from any infrastructure link, you've got to be an extensive
absolutely. No, BRI can't be called a failure. If it wasn't a strong idea, there wouldn't be this pushback. The fact that countries like India, the Saudi Arabia, UAE, America, Europe are coming together is by itself a pushback, and to build an alternate model. So there's a deep idea here. Lots of things have been touched upon in this particular broadcast. Let's actually see how it pans out, because as Michael Kugelman warned, you can have a great idea, but to translate an idea as enormous in size and scope into reality is a whole different matter altogether. For the time being, Andrew Lewing, Kanwal Sibbal, Navdeep Suri and Michael Kugelman for joining me on the News Track. Thank you very much.